welcome back to Sensible SENCO. Tonight I'm in a different location. So we've moved down to the school office. We've moved down to the office to get away from the children for a while. Behind me, I've got the picture that was drawn for me when I left my last school by one of my students, and it sits proud on the wall. Today, I'm going to talk to you about interventions post-COVID-19. And this was a piece of work that was actually commissioned. I was asked to write it for a company. I was asked to write it, and I submitted it at the weekend, and I wrote far too much than they actually needed, and I thought, you know what, this would make good content for a video. So that's what we've got tonight. However, I have to say I'm still slightly excited because I've just come off an hour-long Zoom chat with Carol Vorderman. My brain's still frazzled over that. Whenever and however we return to school, there's no doubt that we're going to need to establish support to address the gaps that will exist. I suppose that's no different to what we actually do at the moment, but the gaps that exist may be a little more present in the students that we hadn't previously worked with, or even exacerbated in the groups who we do work with and haven't been able to access any lessons or teaching that's been going on. Now, whilst I personally really hope that this doesn't fall solely to the SENCO to organise and deliver it, it's without a doubt that we are the ones that are most experienced in identifying provisions and short-term interventions to support our students and move them forwards. So I suspect we will have a significant role to play in actually making all of that happen. Not that we haven't got a significant role to play in making sure our SEN students can come back in and settle, but I imagine we're probably going to end up picking up a load of other students too. Actually, I see this as a massive opportunity to get across that message that every teacher is a teacher of every child, regardless of what their needs are in the classroom. And I know differentiation is a dirty word, but it's that real opportunity to make it clear that their lessons have got to meet the needs of everybody. So the question is, what interventions or provisions might need to be in place when we return to school? And I'm going to go into a little bit of psychology here. I love psychology, and I really wish I'd actually studied it at university, if I'm perfectly honest, but I didn't. I studied sciences instead. Hey-ho. Anyway, Maslow's hierarchy of needs tells us that before starting to deal with anything educational, we need to ensure that the basics have been met. And we've got those basics around psychological needs, we've got the safety needs, we've got self-esteem, we've got belonging and loving needs in there as well. And unless they're met, we can't actually start dealing with the next layer on Maslow's pyramid. So those physiological needs that must be met are things like being able to breathe, having food, having water, having shelter, having clothing, having comfort, having sex. And no, I hope our students are not having sex. But those are the things that we really need to make sure are the basics that are actually covered before we can start looking at the others. And after a long period in lockdown, we know that families are going to be struggling in providing some of these things. Food banks have been inundated with new requests. We know that some families are really struggling for money. We know that the voucher system for free school meals is as a result, one of the things that schools might find themselves doing is having to put in place those things before they can even start doing anything else. And we also know that children grow, and we've had the effect of our 6-week summer holiday has kind of been shifted forward a bit, and then we're going to tag a 6-week summer holiday on the end of it. That's actually going to be 3 months. So we're going to have children who have grown out of their school uniform. And the last thing a family needs when we move back into schools is to be fussing about whether they're wearing the right trousers or the shirt or whatever it is. And I really think schools need to think about how they're going to relax on that a little bit, because it sure as hell ain't a priority. It isn't a priority for me. My money comes in. I'm not going to be fussing about what my children are wearing when they go back to school. If I can get them dressed in the morning at the moment, that's a bonus. So The next layer we need to meet are those safety needs, which are personal financial security, health, order, law, and protection from the elements. Now we can assume, some of those are actually in place. Some of our children will have been exposed to abuse while they've been at home, whether that's, mum really losing her rag and going, oh, just for God's sake, off and leave me alone, or whether that's physical abuse or any other form of abuse. We know that things may have been a little bit strained in some families, not every family. Makes it sound like every family's falling to pieces. It really isn't. We also know that those families that have struggled financially may have had multiple impacts on their children. So they may not have necessarily eaten properly for 3 months. On one side of things, you've got people saying we shouldn't have children if you can't feed them. But at that point where they had their children, they probably had money coming in. They were able to feed them. They probably had a very good life. But all of a sudden, our society has kind of collapsed around us, I suppose. And they're struggling to do that. And whilst children are not directly involved in the financial matters of a family, so they're not the ones going out earning the money, they're probably not the ones having the conversation about, shall we put the money on the electric meter or shall we go and buy a loaf of bread? But they're still impacted by it. They still feel the stresses of parents talking about it, or parents worrying about it, or seeing that mum's not eaten for dinner that night because she's made sure the kids are eating instead. There is increasing evidence out there that this coronavirus is leaving our children and adults even with long-term health difficulties. So, on the news tonight, 1.2 million people have actually recovered from it. Great, wonderful. But how many of those have long-term lung difficulties? We don't actually know at the moment, and we don't know what the impact of that will be in the future. So when we bring our children back into school, people keep talking about, oh, we've not got the arts in the curriculum, we've not got physical exercise in the curriculum. Actually, physical exercise might be something that some of our students are really going to struggle with, perhaps more so than they did previously, or if they have asthma, comparing it to that, we're going to have difficulties. So our next layer in Maslow's hierarchy is around psychological needs. We need to feel loved and we need to feel like we belong to something. And it's things like friendship, love, intimacy, family, community, belonging and relationships. We closed schools in a hurry, and schools are, whether you like it or not, a community. And families have been under strain. Our communities have been splintered and possibly loved ones have been lost. Friendships have been put on hold. All of these need really careful handling. So we've got school wellbeing ambassadors, we've got trained mental health first aiders in schools, if you'd got around to doing it. If you're planning to do it this year, get it done before we go back. I think we're going to find ourselves drawing on their knowledge and experience and information to up everybody's skills. Where they haven't already done so, schools are going to need to consider their counselling offer. They perhaps need to explore trauma-informed practice and ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. So some training around that would be really, really useful. Whilst in the mind of many this might seem a little bit extreme, oh, we've just had an extended break, it's like the 6 weeks holiday, we're all going back. It really isn't like that. The 6 weeks holiday is a fixed period in time. It's predictable. We know when it's coming. And generally speaking, okay, kids might go off to grandma's, whatever it is, or we chuck them in the garden. Not literally. We know what we're doing in that period of time. This has been different. We've closed schools. We've sent the children home. We don't know how long for. We don't know when we're going back. We don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Then we're kind of being told, well, we need to deliver some form of curriculum to them. Some parents can deliver that. Some parents can't. Some schools are being helpful. Some schools are not. It's all up in the air. So we really need to think about the impact on all of our children when we go back to something that is unknown. It really is unknown. None of us know what's happening, to be perfectly honest. And all of this leads to psychological distress, not just in children, in adults as well, but we're talking children here. Children can't articulate what they want to say. Just like I'm stumbling over my words now and how I feel about everything that's going on, Children find it even more difficult. So we might find that their behaviour changes. So a little Freddie who used to sit in the corner and be absolutely perfectly behaved comes back in and, picks the pen up, spends 3 minutes on it, and then wants to go for a walk around the classroom. He's just spent the last 3 months doing that. He's, at home, nobody was making him sit down and do a 1-hour lesson or whatever it is. The esteem needs that we need to meet are self-esteem, achievement, status, confidence, prestige, recognition, mastery and independence. And this is that layer where we find most of our SEN students would normally sit and normally struggle. So because they have TAs to support them, they're not always independent. Because they struggle with things, they perhaps have a lower self-esteem. Perhaps they make lots of mistakes, their confidence is battered. And that's the layer of Maslow's hierarchy where we find our SEN children tend to sit, if you like. But if you then take into account all of these other things that have been going on, that layer's not there, but also those supporting bricks underneath are not there either now, and we might start to see things crumbling. Moving into that very top tier of Maslow's hierarchy, it's what he calls the growth phase, if you like, and I'm going to refer to it as the academic part of it. So if you'd got all those stepping stones and those bricks in place, you can then build on that and start teaching something new or delivering something new with the information. So these are the needs associated with cognition, aesthetic acknowledgement, self-actualization and transcendence. So when we feel we are confident with something, we'll take a risk and we might move it forward even further. When our self-esteem feels good, we feel that we can achieve the next thing and we're more willing to give it a go. That's where education sits. Now this is where normal teaching takes place. It's where our normal working practice is. Our SEN students kind of sit in that layer below most of the time because they're struggling with things, but for the majority of our students in school, they sit in that top layer normally. But for some of those students who have found life pretty easy through school so far, all of a sudden that crumbling of those lower layers is going to make things more difficult for our delivery of teaching. In our class of 30 children, who in our Maslow hierarchy, we probably had 7 or 8 of them that had crumbles in the lower layers. When we come back, we might find that there's possibly 20 children in the class who've got cracks in those layers. And that's when I go back to what I said right at the very beginning, that every teacher is a teacher of every child in their class and needs to meet their needs. No longer is it going to be a couple of them who need something different or something additional. It's going to be a significant chunk that needs something different and additional. And I might be a little cynical here, but I actually think schools that have a high proportion of pupils who are eligible for Pupil Premium are probably going to find it easier to put things in place and address things than schools who have quite low levels of Pupil Premium, because they're just not used to, on bulk, finding programs and sorting it out and doing that kind of thing. So one of the first things we're going to have to do when we get children back in is find out what the gaps are. And that does not mean we can walk through the doors and on day 3 go, right, we're doing a spelling test. We're going to have to build up all of that, those confidence things. We're going to have to build up social and emotional relationships. We're going to have to deal with mental health and well-being before we can even start doing formal academic assessment. However, saying that, we are skilled practitioners. There are ways of finding out if children's ability to write has completely diminished over the 12 weeks. Come on, it's not going to completely disappear, but it may not have developed further. It may have taken a slight backtrack. I think of it like getting on a bike. If you haven't ridden a bike for several years, you don't forget how to ride the bike, but when you first get on it, you might be a bit wobbly, and by the time you've gone down the hill, you've remembered where the brakes are, and you know how to do it again. And for our children, it's going to be a little bit like that. For our SEN children, we might need to put the stabilisers back on for a while. We might need to give them that little bit of extra guidance and support. Much of the work is going to fall to our classroom teachers in sweeping up and filling gaps in knowledge. And I actually think, alongside those schools with high numbers of pupil premium, I actually think primary schools are probably going to be much better at this than secondary schools. And that probably sounds really awful coming from somebody who's spent half their career in secondary schools. I know the reason I think that is because they're with one teacher all the time. So for that one teacher, they can work out very quickly what the gaps are for that child and to deliver it. In a secondary school where we're moving them every 55 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, we've got different members of staff dipping in and out, and different people are finding out different things. And even though the English teacher might have discovered, oh my goodness, they've made no progress with literacy at all, it might take the maths teacher 3 weeks to discover that if they were doing it on their own. I think secondary schools tend to be far more academically driven, so they're more likely to reach for a CATS test or an NFER test or whatever they're using than a primary school that will ask them to write a story about the butterflies that have hatched in the corner of the classroom and use that piece of work to get their assessment. A secondary school is more likely to throw a test in front of them and sit them in silence for 30 minutes. Now, that's the last thing these kids need after not being with their peers for quite a long time, but also after being in an environment where they've been possibly allowed to do what they want for 3 months or whatever. A lot of the strategies that we use for teaching students with special educational needs will actually benefit all students. So again, I think this is a great opportunity to rethink education and the way we actually deliver things. Now, we know from the Education Endowment Foundation, because they're always doing their research, that things like metacognition, cognitive load, dual coding, explicit instruction, knowledge organisers, quality feedback, they are all things that really, really help all learners. But we also know they really, really help our SEN learners as well. Taking our SEN learners out of the classroom and going and doing something different with them doesn't necessarily address their need and doesn't fill their gaps that they have, because they're then missing the next bit that's happening in the classroom. If the classroom teacher is delivering it, everybody gets it. Where we have significant gaps, so big gaps have developed, then it might be appropriate to put in place something short term. And I'd like to think, okay, SENCOs might be advising what that is, Pupil Premium coordinators might be involved because they've got a bit of experience in this too, but I'd like to think that we've got teachers delivering that and not just pulling the TA out of the classroom because Freddie's not in today and getting them to deliver it. So we could be delivering some short-term, really focused work with small groups of students, and I do mean short-term. Just because we've been off for 12 weeks doesn't mean it needs to be a 12-week programme of support. We should be able to kind of plug that gap quite quickly with our neurotypical learners. Where it's an SEN pupil, we might actually find ourselves backtracking a little bit. So if we had got to page 84 of Toe by Toe, I'm that there again, we might need to backtrack to page 70 and recap some of that before we try to move them on. And even if we go back to page 70 and they're getting 100% of it correct and they're doing it quickly and fluently, I actually think that's a good thing, because it will give them the confidence to go, actually, yeah, I can still do this. Yeah, I am going to get it right. Whilst our children have been at home, some of them will have been ignored. Some of them will have had parents screaming at them saying, get on with it, you should be able to do it, your teacher set it, they know what level you are, come on, you should be able to do it. And then others might have had far more one-to-one attention than they've previously had in school. And that's no disrespect to the school, it's simply the fact that we don't have enough bodies in a classroom. We don't have 30 teachers for 30 children, or even 15 teachers for 30 children. When they're at home, some parents have been furloughed and not working, might have patients that are saint, and they might be sitting there working with their child. So some of our children might have actually come along in leaps and bounds. Others might have just carried on plodding, and others might have just fallen off the radar somewhere. I'm also going to say, be really wary of any of this online work that has been submitted. When we're in a classroom and we ask children to produce a piece of work for us, generally speaking, we can see when they've copied it off their neighbour, or when they've not particularly done it for themselves, so perhaps the TA's prompted them a little bit with it. When they're submitting their online work, we don't have that oversight. We can't see what's going on. So it could well have been older brother who's completed it for him. Sorry. Or it might even have been mum or dad who have actually done the piece of work. Or they've sat down with the child and gone, oh, for goodness sake, you know what 2 + 1 is. Let's do it again. It isn't 4, it's 3. Change it to a 3. We don't know. We really don't know. So just be really wary of relying on that online submission for assessing where any gaps might actually exist. So once the school is secure in its knowledge that those lower tiers of the hierarchy have been met and they're ready to plug the knowledge gap, they're going to need to decide on the best approach. And where those gaps can't be covered in the classroom and interventions are required, this has to follow the principles of not reducing curriculum entitlement. So we still need creative activity, we still need physical activity with its caveats, and they are just as important as a traditional academic curriculum. Now, many schools will have made use of technology during the closure, and this might actually be the solution to some of the continuing issues on return. You might have found some of your students have got much greater engagement with an online programme than they ever have with you in the classroom. You might have found some students who really struggle putting pen on paper, but have actually managed to produce pieces of work, a page long or whatever, using Word or text help or something like that. So we really need to encourage children not to lose those skills when they come back in, and to actually develop them further. And I had a video I did last week for you about using assistive technologies, and I'm actually a firm believer in using assistive technologies, and the idea of being able to bring that back into school and use it will meet a lot of the special educational needs that we have. On to what interventions will work. Well, what worked before, it isn't any different. So if they've got a comprehension gap, you're looking at a comprehension programme. We used to use Hackney Lit, but whether that's appropriate for you, I don't know. But it's just working on those things. Or maybe it's just a case of going, you know what, the spring term curriculum? On to what interventions will work. It will depend entirely on the school budget, on what you can afford. We're going to have to put in place social distancing, so we already know we're probably going to have to split classes down as it is. So hopefully those smaller class sizes and that little bit more of attention that children can get will really help. Putting that technology in place, so perhaps, maybe our classes of 30 are going to go down to 15. 5 of the children are working on computers, 5 of the children are working independently, 5 of them working with the teacher. That would be, it works well in primary schools, doesn't always work quite so well in secondary schools, but that would be an ideal way around delivering both that social distancing and delivering an intervention or appropriate programme to address the gaps that we might have. I have a concern around technological divides that will have occurred over this period of time. So some schools do not have the facility to give every child a PC or a laptop or a tablet in the classroom to continue that work. And some children will have spent the whole period of this closure glued to a laptop screen or whatever and learning how to use those things, whereas others have had no access to it at all. And I just have a little bit of a worry around that, because technology is actually so important to us these days and moving forward that we can't afford to let our children fall behind in that, just as we can't afford to let them fall behind with their literacy and their numeracy skills. I think that use of technology involves using your fingers and using your hands. Technology requires the use of fine motor skills, the ability to move the mouse around, the ability to tap on a screen and move something from one place to the next. They're fine motor skills, not gross motor skills. And gross motor skills may not have been developed over the last couple of months. So we've got children who tend to be slightly more active than adults, even though we've got the reports of increasing obesity in 5-year-olds. They do tend to be a bit more active, but over this period of time, they haven't been able to go out, run around with their friends, play football, go to the park, all the rest of it. So unless parents have been chucking them out in the garden on the trampoline all day, every day, unless they've been doing that, children are probably going to have lost some of their physical abilities. I don't mean that their muscles have completely atrophied away. I do mean, though, that their stamina and their ability to do things may have declined. You're not going to have lost your bend it like Beckham football star. They're probably still going to be a football star, but they might be a bit slower when we first get back to things. And I will go back to what I said about the long-term medical difficulties, because we know that some people who have had COVID-19 continue to have those breathing difficulties for a long period of time afterwards. And we know that from the scans, they've got those clouds or starbursts or whatever it is on their lungs. You wouldn't believe I was a scientist, would you? We know that's happening. We know they're going to possibly struggle, and we don't know the long-term implications of that. So it might be 2 years down the line and we've got a class of students who need a nebulizer every 30 minutes. That will therefore have an impact on our PE lessons and what we're delivering there. So we just need to think about what we're going to do, build our children's exercise and stamina and ability to be outside and do things physically. We need to build that up just as much as we need to build up their literacy, their numeracy, their technology skills and all the others that kind of go in there. This was a video to talk about post-19 interventions, what we might be thinking about putting in place. I haven't said, you know, you need to go and buy Lexia or you need to go and buy this and you need to put this in place, because for every school it will be different. For every child in every school it will be different. I don't believe it's a role of the SENCO in entirety. I believe the SENCO has a role to play in supporting that strategically, but it should not fall to the SENCO to deal with all of these gaps, because this is not a special educational need in the same sense as we've had before. This is a whole country need. And we just need to fill those gaps in the same way as we were supposed to fill the gaps, narrow the gaps if you like, for our Pupil Premium students. We need to do the same now for our post-COVID-19 cohorts of pupils. I hope that some of that video made sense to you. I hope you're all taking care of yourselves. I'm going to go and find myself a nice hot chocolate now and reflect on my day, especially the bit talking to Carol Vorden. I just can't really focus now. Anyway, take care guys. Bye bye.